Thank you, Katerina, and good afternoon, everyone, on this beautiful day here in Vienna. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to demonstrate to you why climate change is important to investors and cannot be ignored, leaving aside any ethical or moral considerations. I'll appeal to the head rather than the heart. Within that context, I'll also talk briefly about what role infrastructure specifically can play in the climate transition and the types of opportunities we see in the market, not just in the future, but here today, now, and accessible. I'll also touch on what the barriers are to further investment in the climate transition and what we can do collectively to overcome them. So to begin with, let's take a moment just to go back to basics and consider some fundamental principles of investing. We all know that when we invest, that's a combination of opportunity, but also risk. And as you see around those central bubbles, we have a number of well-established macroeconomic or other factors that influence both opportunity and risk. And I don't think there's anyone in the audience that would question either the importance of GDP or inflation or labor market statistics on investment outcomes. I would argue that climate change is equally as important as a factor in driving both opportunity and risk from an investment perspective. We identified this at Mercer in 2011 in our groundbreaking climate change study, and others in the market have followed since. The real challenge with that is, up until relatively recently, the data hasn't been collected on the impact of climate change on investments in the same way that it has done for things like inflation or the labor market and so on. And so on that basis, it's very easy to dismiss the potential impact. But that data is increasingly being collected and incorporated into models and strategic asset allocations. That may all sound a bit too long-term and uncertain in terms of the time horizon and the impact. But let's consider some things that are going on right here, right now, that have been influenced in some way, shape, or form by climate change. So here are some examples on screen, and I'll start from the top left and work round. So we have a very famous car manufacturer here that, interestingly, is only the world's 20th largest producer of cars, but is the largest in terms of market cap by over 3 times compared to its nearest rival, which is the largest by volume. And it's also on a multiple or a ratio which is more than 10 times that of its nearest rival. Now, that is interesting. What is driving that fundamental position? We look there, the next picture, that is of Lismore in Australia. Well, it was a picture of Lismore in Australia before the catastrophic flooding earlier this year in February. The cost of rebuilding the city now is estimated at around about $1 billion Australian dollars. But interestingly, before the floods, businesses and homes were being quoted tens of thousands of dollars to insure their homes against flood risk. And surprisingly, many, if not all, were underinsured as a result. Again, that's a case of a market inefficiency or a market failing as a result of climate change. The next picture is from the test site from the Dogger Bank wind farm, which is being built in the North Sea. It'll be 3.6 gigawatts of energy, 600 turbines, the largest turbine in production here today, representing about 5% of the UK's energy demand once fully completed in 2026. The question would be, if climate change isn't important, why would the investors here be spending £9 billion in this series of projects? The next one is coal mining, and this is a really interesting one because it highlights a point that climate change from an investment perspective isn't necessarily a one-way street. There will potentially be losers within an overall winning theme, and there will be winners within an overall losing theme. And at the moment, things like coal may be an example of that if you look at things like share prices. But interestingly, a number of these coal majors have been divesting assets in traditional thermal coal and focusing on steel coal. Again, if climate change wasn't an issue, why would they be doing that? The next picture is of a stadium in Qatar for the football fans out there for the World Cup later this year. This stadium is going to be air-conditioned. Now, regardless of whether it's publicly or privately financed, that represents a cost and a design challenge for an asset which is based on climate. It's based on environment. And then finally, very timely, but also somewhat unfortunate, we're increasingly seeing climate change have an impact in the way that businesses run and operate. And where those businesses are listed, as in this particular case, there appears to have been a direct and immediate impact on things like share price, which relates directly back to investments. So hopefully, this range of examples across different geographies, different sectors, highlights the importance here today of the climate change thematic to investors here today. It's not off in the distant future at some uncertain time horizon and with some unknown impact. Within that context, I want to talk about why infrastructure is particularly important. And we fully understand, in order to meet the climate transition challenge, we need both adaptation measures, but also mitigation measures. And in order to achieve both of those, infrastructure is very much at the heart of those aims. And again, there are some examples here of the types of opportunities that we have seen in the market here today for investors, both in the adaptation space, but also in the mitigation space. So just to pick out a few, things like EV charging networks. The popularity of EVs is becoming ever more apparent, but one of the limiting factors to further adoption is the associated networks so that people can charge at home or on their journeys, the so-called range anxiety. That is something we're seeing in the market as an investable opportunity. Similarly, energy from waste or recycling, the circular economy. Again, that is something that has attracted a lot of institutional capital relatively recently because it's a way of playing into the climate change thematic, but also, frankly, of making money. As we move more to an electrified world, we will need to find a way of bringing on renewable energy in a more consistent way, hence the need for battery storage and other forms of energy storage. Similarly, as temperatures may vary across different geographies over time, increased use of heating and cooling, so district heating networks, are again increasingly becoming popular. The list goes on, but what I would highlight again is that these are opportunities here and now, and if you were to look at things like a renewable energy portfolio, a climate change transition portfolio, or even a generalist unlisted infrastructure portfolio, you would see examples of these assets here and now. And indeed, for some of the investors in the room, you may already have exposure to these types of assets within your portfolios. So that's all relatively positive, but clearly there is a mismatch between the demand for capital and the supply for capital. What are some of the issues that are holding that process up? And I've highlighted some of these on the slide here for consideration. So the two that I've touched on earlier from an academic investment modeling perspective are time horizon and impact. When exactly is climate change going to affect my portfolio, either positively or negatively? And if it is going to affect my portfolio, and for some people that is a big if, what is the quantum? What is the scale of the impact going to be? Are we talking a few basis points? Are we talking tens of percentage points? That can be a reason not to progress, not to understand, not to do something. But I would argue, as I've shown with the examples on the previous slides, that we're already seeing evidence, both positive and negative, of the impact of this thematic on our portfolios. There are other more subtle challenges, but nonetheless equally as important, related to people and human interaction. One of them, as I alluded to earlier, is this issue of greenwashing, which is increasingly becoming an issue within the market. There is a risk of becoming jaded by the number of offerings out there, a risk of confusion, and a fear as well of potentially making the wrong decision. Similarly, there is, unfortunately, a disconnect between the political life cycle, which may be 4 or 5 years, and the climate transition life cycle, which is going to be decades, if not longer. We don't really have the systems and the structures in place to provide clarity, consistency, and transparency on things like policy making and regulation that are conducive to investment. And I would suggest that these are important areas that need to be addressed, but they can be addressed, and they can be addressed through knowledge and knowledge sharing. But that requires the input and the contribution of all key stakeholders, not just investors, but advisors like me, and also politicians and regulators, to establish that framework that I've talked about, which makes the flow of capital from its source to where it's needed with respect to climate change as possible and as efficient as possible. So that's all well and good, but what should we be doing? And again, I've highlighted the 3 key stakeholders I believe are integral to this process and to this discussion: politicians, investors themselves, and advisors like me. And from my perspective and my experience of working with institutional investors for a number of years globally, these are some of the key takeaways. So one of the key things is that, from an investor perspective, climate change shouldn't be ignored. You can have your own views around its importance, its significance, time horizon, but it's not something that you should exclude from your discussions, because like the other factors that we've talked about, it is having and will have an impact on your portfolio, whether you choose to believe it or not. For politicians and regulators, the message here would be to take a step back almost and set up clear, transparent, independent, long-term structures that provide the stability and the reassurance that investors need to allocate and lock up their capital for a long period of time. Now, that is a challenge because there can be a misalignment of interest, there can be other motives at play, but ultimately that is what is needed, and that is something that a number of investors themselves also request, but sadly find lacking. And it'd be very easy for me to stand on stage and tell everyone else to do things, but there is also a role for advisors as well. And our role is to act as conduits of knowledge and information, but to do that in a clear, honest, and unbiased way, without any vested interest. So there's potentially a lot of despair around the energy transition or the climate change transition. So I wanted to leave you with a bit of hope, and what better way to do that than a quote from one of Austria's finest exports and a leading voice on climate change. So where there is despair, I would say that there is also hope. And collectively and collaboratively, I think we can work together to come to the solution that we're all ultimately seeking to achieve. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Amarik, thank you so much for your input. Since I can't ask you for an investment advice on stage, maybe still one short question is, what's the investment you never did but you wish you had?
That's a great question, Katerina. There's one very recently that I would talk about and that comes to mind, which was actually, ironically, a toll road in an emerging market believe it or not. And you may think, well, how is that sustainable? But the point I'd like to make here is that we also need to consider what is our definition of sustainability. We're talking at the moment about climate change, but there are other aspects to this broader topic. And what was particularly appealing about this opportunity was not only did it stack up from an investment perspective, which is the first and most important thing, because we have that fiduciary duty and responsibility, but across E, S, and G, it was contributing significantly to sustainable economic growth within that country, the creation of jobs and upskilling of people, actually the upgrading and the support of the local flora and fauna through investments around the project. And ironically, perhaps a slight reduction, at least in the short to mid-term, of pollution by simply freeing up the bottlenecks that were otherwise on the current road. One of the things that we miss is that actually a lot of pollution is created by cars just sitting there idling. If they flow much faster and the road is much safer, it can be a better outcome. So that would be one example, but again, I would highlight it for those broader reasons of sustainability, perhaps something that we can discuss later during the day.
And we will discuss later and come up for you to give us advice. Thank you so much, Amarik Ubhi.